David Sanderson is the Glenn Gould of Discord.
Who's Glenn Gould?
Talking with famous people.
I was just curious if you wanted to like make a video on the paper as like educational content.
I mean, I've been thinking you're occupying the same headspace I'm occupying. I was thinking about it a lot last night. I was feeling mad about it. Once I got up this morning, I wasn't mad about it anymore. But yeah, I think I do. And he says, I'm going to use these two definitions. Both of the words he defines are adverbs, interestingly. So, okay. And he defines them pointlessly as objectively, with regards to the objective universe, also that which is an actuality. Note that when you make a good definition, what should you do? It should be able to afford to be used to determine the status of something. This doesn't allow you to determine the status of anything. Okay, so contrast his definition of objective and subjective with how I approach the question. First, I point out that it's generally used in two specific ways. One, it's used to mean a disinterested calculus. So if I'm a referee, I'm supposed to be fair, right? And use a disinterested calculus. I'm not supposed to try to make one team win or the other team. That would be an interested calculus. I want my team to win. A disinterested calculus is I want the fouls to be called correctly. So that's one way that people use the term. They say this person is being objective or not being objective. They mean they are being influenced by their interests or not. Now, the other way that people use the term is to refer to data. Objective data is external. Subjective data is not, is internal. So what that functionally means, if you want to make a more meaningful distinction than saying external and internal, is that objective data is data that third parties can validate independently of me, whereas subjective data is data that cannot be validated independently of me. If I tell you that I felt sad this morning, you can't validate that. I'm the only one who has access to the data. If, on the other hand, I tell you I went to Ralph's this morning, it's potentially validatable because the data is external. In other words, there's a videotape of Ralph's in the morning. In theory, I could access it and determine whether or not you're telling the truth. So those are the ways people actually use the words objective and subjective. Now, you might also say objective means of the object in its literal sense, and subjective means of the subject. People casually use the words to mean right or wrong, or logical or illogical, which is not what they mean. In other words, a person can be very objective and still completely wrong. A disinterested calculus does not guarantee that you are correct. We can parse it out linguistically. What are subjects and objects in sentences, and what role do they play? In other words, we can meaningfully define these terms. We don't have to use gobbledygook. Look at this shit. Objectively, with regards to the objective universe. Okay, so why is he using objectively rather than objective, first of all? Which consequently entails the locally observable physical universe. So, the objective universe entails the locally observable physical universe. Also, regarding that which is in actuality. So, you put is in scare quotes. What are we supposed to do with that? I mean, how is this definition meaningful? Note the contrast, right? That my definitions are meaningful. Subjectively, with regards to a human person and human experience. Also, regarding that which is experienced by a subject. So then this paper is subjective because I'm experiencing it, right? This is what happens when you don't care at all about being serious about language. And when you demean the entire industry of philosophizing with this kind of garbage. What is existence objectively and what is existence subjectively? Okay, the issue of existentiality is part of conditional logic called quantification theory, and it specifically covers the fact that we can not only do P, Q, R, S, whatever, but we can have quantifiers and modifiers that apply things as well. So we can include in logic things like all sheeps that have fur instead of just all sheeps. With quantification theory, it allows you to say, to establish that there exists at least one instance of a sheep that does not have fur, and blah, 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 blah. So existentiality is, just like everything else on the map level, an issue of mapping statuses. It's not some fundamental axiomatic reality that you can try to establish or reference. It's a status that we afford to an element being treated as an object of analysis. And using Descartes' reasoning as a starting position, provided scaffolding for this hypothesis, but why start with Descartes' reasoning? The reason he explains is the only answer humanity has ever had so far is, I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am, thus I exist. But that's not humanity's only answer. It says here, however, as a counter to such experiments, our species has, it seems, only one response, the reasoning of Descartes. Well, that's not true. I mean, that's just patently false. Has shit tons of responses. And not all of them are a breakdown into dualism that's predicated on existentiality. So it's like he's not even beginning to do any real work. He's beginning with Descartes' reasoning, and his justification for it is that's humanity's only answer to these questions. But it's not.
I'm sort of doubting you for some reasons, but I mean, that actually seems like it would actually be a valid response to the theory. Like you could actually...
I honestly don't think there's any theory in here. When I go through it, it seems like a bunch of gobbledygook. So it's important to have a contrasting example, what it looks like when philosophy actually is done properly, right? Introduction. Please consider the following claim for 1 to 2 minutes before proceeding to the next page. Claim. Every person has a personality. Note, I'm not making that claim. I'm asking the reader to consider the claim. What you thought about during that minute or two says a lot about you. Do you think any of these things? And then I list a bunch of things that you might possibly have thought. Note, I still haven't made any claims yet. Now, I taxonomy the kinds of responses. So the kinds of responses that I've articulated fall into 2 kinds of categories. Deconstructive or constructive. Again, I'm not making any claims that you could have any problem with because I've suggested these are possible responses and categorize the possible responses that I generated. So I'm taking seriously my job, okay? Here's his justification. To exist as a subject within a universe of some sort is to exist the potentiality of theory as if it were true and happening, when it is more accurately just one of the ways things could exist. Therefore, the existence of the local universe is theoretical rather than simply objective. One of many potential existences contained within the metaphysical multiverse, whereas said multiverse potentiality is an actual consequence of objectivity. Whose objectivity? Whose the multiverse is the consequence of whose objectivity? Remembering, of course, that objectivity is something that people have or don't have, that they apply or fail to apply. He gives real thinkers a bad name. He gives real thinkers a bad name. You know, people can legitimately say, it's just all a bunch of bullshit and gobbledygook. Why would I care about philosophy if that's their example? The existence of the local universe is theoretical rather than simply objective. That conclusion does not follow from what he said before in any way, shape, or form. He does not distinguish between that which is theoretical and that which is objective. He distinguishes definitionally between that which is subjective and that which is objective. He does not make any clarification as to why something that is theoretical is more than simply objective. Are some theories more or less objective than others? Frames. Physical frames are borders. The walls of my house frame my living space. Verb. When people use the word frame as a verb, it generally has a negative connotation. Real estate agents stage homes to frame the experience for the prospective buyer. An innocent man might exclaim, I was framed. Or Julie tries to frame it as concern, but she's really just stirring up drama. So framing and other verb forms of the word usually indicate an attempt to influence people without their becoming aware of having been being influenced. Unless framework is made explicit, it's generally seen as manipulative. This is so because most frames are unnoticed common distinctions. In other words, arguing physical frames just produces silliness. A knock at the door prompts, "Come inside," muffled response from the other side. Which side of the wall is inside? Personality. The aspects of a human being that remain the same from childhood through old age, barring brain injury or massive identity shifting trauma. 2. Incorporate. A. To incorporate is to confer an identity upon something by naming it. Identity. A distinction indicating unique among others of the same kind. B. Example, Howard's rock has an identity, a rock doesn't. Okay, so these are meaningful definitions. Whether or not something has an identity can be determined operationally with this definition.
Right.
Event, an incorporated stretch of time. What's to incorporate? It's to confer an identity upon something by naming it. So it's a named stretch of time. Okay? Topical. That which impacts within a given frame is said to be topical to that frame. So in other words, whether or not I'm a good public speaker is irrelevant if I'm riding a rodeo bull.
Yeah.
That skill does not validate in that frame. The frame of the rodeo is not one that rewards the skill of being a good public speaker. Let's look at the alternative approach.
Oh my God.
Reduction of reality to elements which are irreducible. Like extracting all the pure gold from ore. Is that what you mean by reduction of reality to elements that are irreducible? If you mean it in the physical world, it makes some sense, right?
Yeah.
Because, yeah, you can take the gold out of ore, get to the irreducible element. The chemical element, is, in fact, irreducible definitionally. It's not a mixture of multiple substances. Okay, so he's appealing to this notion, which is a real thing in the physical world. However, he doesn't mean it literally, he means it metaphorically, but using the method of proof by contradiction. So, in other words, that it must be gold because it's if it weren't gold, then it wouldn't melt at this temperature. And if it weren't gold, then it wouldn't be acceptable to be used as fillings of teeth. And if it weren't gold, it wouldn't have this atomic weight. Except, what is he saying is the equivalent metaphorical fundamental? Well, he claims that the explanation of existence presented in this paper is that they could not possibly be any other way, and that therefore they comprise a complete account of all phenomena discovered or undiscovered. Now, this paper in no way, shape, or form comprises a complete account of all phenomena. Nothing he says in here even attempts to be a complete account of all phenomena. So he's using words fast and loose. What he means is it attempts to answer the question of why things are rather than are not. Of course, that question is, as soon as you start to answer that question from an analyst perspective, in other words, to analyze the question, you miss the boat. Because you need to stop back there and go, okay, linguistically, what are we doing? So if we're asking the question, why things exist rather than not exist, we're saying, normally in our frame of reference, we'll understand why something happens or exists based on we see some sort of causal link, right? So like, well, why did this house burn down? Well, because there was an electrical fire. Okay. Now, if you ask, well, why does Bob exist? Well, because his parents had sex. And that's the answer to why does every entity exist in the causal answer. He's trying to say, why does existence exist? Okay. Existence exists because we use it logically to distinguish between null sets and sets that are not null. In other words, it's an operationalized term. He's treating it as though it were some sort of mystical attainment or something. I don't know. It's extremely confusing because it doesn't make any sense. The ideas presented in this paper, if true, dispel the need for religiosity and establish an intersubjective rational basis. Intersubjective, meaning, I don't know if he means universal, it means between different subjects. So, in other words, it sustains scrutiny universally. Is that what you're saying? It is a rational, universally sustained argument of metaphysical propositions that will provide a unifying moral philosophy. The fact that you said dispel the need for means you aren't taking language seriously. You are not taking language seriously. Individuals engage in a behavior of faith for a variety of reasons. So, if in fact your logical proof were airtight, the claim that you would dispel the need for religion would still be patently, objectively, obviously false. Not to mention extraordinarily presumptuous, because you're assuming everybody has the same source of their need for religion. So, for example, are you claiming that if the ideas in your paper were true, which it's not even a meaningful conditional to make, because you're not presenting ideas really in your paper, you're presenting metaphors and gobbledygook, okay? But that it would dispel my need for religion. But see, my need for religion was to quit drinking. So would your paper fill that role? I mean, even if the ideas, even if I were to believe everything you said was God's gospel, I just didn't understand it because I was too dumb, rather than because it's not saying anything. If I were to be that person, would then I be able to appeal to what in your ideas to help me? The tautological necessity of existence being as it is, because it is that way? Dear tautological argument about existence, please help me quit drinking. There's some bold, ridiculous claims you're making, right? Completely unsubstantiated. This is Dunning-Kruger at its absolute worst and most offensive. It gives all philosophy a bad name. Again, look at how it looks when it's done right. I'm talking about framing creates a distinction between the means and the ends. Debaters in a formal match will argue about what counts directly in a section of their speech called framework. Framework comprises all ground arguments, and ground arguments draw out of bounds lines around certain kinds of claims. This phenomenon is not unique to verbal argumentation, but in the physical world, what counts is not usually in any dispute. Our soccer match provides an example. Within the flow of play frame, instrumentality as a means to, stealing the ball and making a perfect pass to a streaking teammate counts as an instrumental action within the flow of play frame. A great pass becomes a great play if and only if your teammate scores. An end, attainment, scoring a goal in this frame is attainment. Scoring a goal answers the question, why? Why am I running down this field kicking the soccer ball? It doesn't matter how lucky you got or how poorly you kicked the ball. If you score, you attained. Topicality and out of bounds. So not only am I defining the terms meaningfully, I'm showing you how to use them. Since they are properly operationalized terms, I'm demonstrating the use of these definitions to make substantial work intellectually, so that you can take any event and parse it out into mentality, attainment, and topicality, or out of bounds, right? True or false, no truth value. This video was challenging to make, challenging to edit. I'm sure it needs to be better edited, but it falls so short of acceptability that you don't even know where to begin to negate it. It's like you can't get two sentences in. And I don't know if this is an ENTP who has been enabled in his bullshit for too long. I don't know if it's an ENFP, which seems maybe more likely. The sort of showboating, the proof by contradiction as like a big, it kind of feels ENFP-ish. And of course, it's so crazy because the premises that he's predicating stuff on are either just definitionally tautological or just not claims that validate with any observation, any natural observation. The language he's using, he's trying to use a lot of philosophy terms, but if he were really going to be actually competent at it, he'd need to say, instead of saying this entails the local physical world, for example, he'd say that the local physical world supervenes upon, for example, which means something philosophically. Entails. What the hell does that mean? That the grand universe entails the local physical universe? Does it mean that? Because, I mean, the fundamental problem is he's trying to remove the observer, the actual human being, from the equation. A real theory of everything would explain why he wrote this paper. Cognitive functions approaches a real theory of everything. If he is an ENFP, it explains it. Because he's attempting to... He is as if I were attempting to be a grief counselor. It is not a job he's suited for if he's an ENFP. So, when you don't come into something like this from a switch side debate kind of perspective, namely, first I need to make sure I can argue both sides as well as it can possibly be argued before I start making my own affirmations and trying to sustain them.
Talking with famous people.
So hopefully this has been educational, and hopefully Matt Acutt, or whatever his name is thoroughly demoralized by this. You should be. You should never lift a pen to write another word of philosophy. I'm not one to discourage people from whatever their passions are, but sir, you are on a front to good thinking.